few dozen yards, but the experiment was considered a success. The force of the bomb's impact suggested the destructive power of the Fritz X was too much for the battleships of World War II. According to the group's calculations, the bomb hit the ground traveling about 290 miles per hour. After the collision, 7 feet of the bomb's total length of 11 feet were buried underground. So these bombs performed exactly as the originals did, and as they came down on their target. So for whatever reason, the Fritz X wasn't put into mass deployment, but if it would have, it really could have made a big difference. Okay, so those were speculative weapons. Let's get to something that a lot of people talk about when they talk about German weapons in World War II, and that's Germany's development of an atomic bomb. Now, of course, Germany had an atomic weapons program. The name of its program in English was Uranium Club, and it began in April 1939, only a few months after German scientists Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann discovered fission. Germany actually had a head start over the Manhattan Project and some of the best atomic scientists, and they had an industrial base, sufficient materials, and military officers who were interested in the program. But despite all that, they were far away from actually developing a nuclear weapon. Werner Heisenberg, the head of the German nuclear program, after he heard news that the United States had dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, said, "I don't believe a word of the whole thing." All right, so why were they so far behind if it seems like they had every advantage going into it? Well, let's go back a few years. The United States was aware of the German nuclear program in August 1939. Albert Einstein wrote to President Roosevelt, warning that it may become possible to set up a nuclear chain reaction in a large mass of uranium, by which vast amounts of power and large quantities of new radium-like elements would be generated. So the United States started a race to develop an atomic bomb, believing that whoever had it first would win the war. The site Atomic Heritage describes Germany's nuclear program in detail, and especially delves into America's reaction to this. Robert Furman, who was assistant to General Leslie Groves and the chief of foreign intelligence for the Manhattan Project, described how the Manhattan Project was built on fear that the enemy had the bomb or would have it before we could develop it. The scientists knew this to be the case because they were refugees from Germany, a large number of them, and they'd studied under the Germans before the war broke out. Physicist Leona Marshall-Libby recalled, "I think everyone was terrified that we were wrong, the Germans were ahead of us. Germany led the civilized world of physics in every aspect, and at the time war set in, when Hitler lowered the boom, it was a very frightening time." The United States was equally afraid. General Grove said, "Unless and until we had positive knowledge to the contrary, we had to assume that the most competent German scientists and engineers were working on an atomic program with the full support of their government and with the full capacity of the German industry at their disposal. Any other assumption would have been unsound and dangerous." Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors. There was even consideration of kidnapping Werner Heisenberg in Switzerland in 1942, but this never happened. In 1943, the U.S. launched the Alsos mission, a foreign intelligence project focused on learning the extent of Germany's nuclear program. But by 1944, they realized that the Germans hadn't come close to developing a bomb and only advanced to preliminary research. The Allies detained 10 German scientists after Germany's defeat at Farm Hall, a bugged house in England. They were there from July 3rd, 1945 to January 3rd, and they suspected the scientists would unwind and, not knowing they were bugged, speak freely. Some of them, such as Heisenberg, Kurt Diebner, and Karl von Weizsäcker, were directly involved in the project. Heisenberg's disbelief at hearing the United States had dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima confirmed to the Allies that the German effort was never close. As one German scientist explained, "It must have taken factories large as the United States to make that much uranium-235. Part of the reason that they didn't succeed is that they didn't have something like the Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project was a closely coordinated effort between science and government and industry, but there wasn't anything like this in Germany. While at Farm Hall, the German physicist Horst Korsching said, "The Americans are capable of real cooperation on a tremendous scale." But he said it would have been impossible in Germany. Each one said the other was unimportant. Also, being successful would have required an enormous logistical and financial push, which the United States had, But with the German government not believing that the bomb project would be successful, they committed fewer and fewer resources to it. One of the flaws of the German project was that many top German scientists had left Germany. Some of them were Jewish, fleeing the new laws of German National Socialism. Others left in protest, decreasing the number of experts available to work on the bomb. Many of them actually came to the United States to work on the Manhattan Project. But the bigger problem was support. Hitler was more interested in the V2 project than he was in the atomic bomb. After later hearing a 1942 lecture given by Heisenberg to scientists and government officials, Hans Bethe remarked, "My first reaction is that Heisenberg knew a lot more than I have always thought. The fact he reached many of these conclusions in one evening is most remarkable. In his lecture, it was clear he was talking to people who were quite ignorant. Apparently, the other people didn't know very much about fission." And whatever work was happening in Germany was halted in June of 1942. They didn't achieve a successful chain reaction, they couldn't enrich uranium, and they didn't consider plutonium a viable substitute. Heisenberg said in his memoir, "The government decided that work on the reactor project must be continued, but only on a modest scale. No orders were given to build atomic bombs." It became clear that the technical prerequisites for production would take years to develop, 2 years at the earliest, even if the program was given maximum support, and German resources were given to other priorities. Now, a popular theory for the failure of the project is that Heisenberg sabotaged the program so that Hitler wouldn't have the bomb. But there's not much evidence about this. Author Richard Rhodes wrote, "There was at least one speculation that one of the German scientists deliberately falsified measurements in graphite, hoping to stop a German bomb program. I don't think there's really evidence to support that. It seems to have been a mistake in the course of developing these various components of the technology." So historians mostly agree that problems with the German project came from miscalculations and a lack of popularity. And the allegations of sabotage really aren't that well substantiated. So the sum is that even though the German nuclear program didn't come close to fruition, it did kickstart the Manhattan Project. Something that's forgotten in the wake of Hiroshima and Nagasaki is that the Manhattan Project was originally conceived for the war in Europe and that nuclear weapons would be used there. But the bomb wasn't ready for operational use at that time. Had it been, it most likely would have been used, especially if Germany was digging in its heels and refusing to surrender. Now, like I said at the beginning of this episode, the myth of Nazi superscience came out of a fusion of two things. First of all, Germany was a scientifically advanced nation. It had some of the oldest universities in Europe and produced several engineers and scientists that are famous, and their names are synonymous with their inventions like Gutenberg, Fahrenheit, Geiger, and Zeppelin. And many of the Nobel Prize winners were from Germany: Erwin Schrödinger, Max Planck, Werner Heisenberg, Albert Einstein. 14 of the first 31 Nobel Prizes for chemistry went to the Germans. So this scientific base, coupled with the Nazis' open declaration that they were developing advanced weapons for the purposes of propaganda, led to this belief, and it lived on in fiction, in Captain America, in Robert Heinlein, in Iron Sky, because it was a specter that existed at the end of the war, and Nazis have always been a convenient villain, so you put those two together and you have a good trope to work with. But to round off this episode, there is a more realistic legacy of Nazi superweapons that go beyond a fiction trope. And that's, interestingly enough, the space program in the United States. When I talked about the V2 rocket program, I mentioned Wernher von Braun, and he ended up being one of the architects of the Apollo program. He and other scientists were brought to the United States in secret in 1945. So I think it's good to focus a little bit on him to close out this topic in maybe a positive note. When the war came to a close in 1945, both American and Russian officials wanted to scheme to get that technology for themselves, for the V2 rocket program. Even though it didn't make a huge difference in the war, they both saw the incredible potential. If the rockets could be industrialized and built by the thousands and powered for long-range attack, well, that's essentially what the Cold War was. It was an arms race. So what happened is that 88 Nazi scientists arrived in the United States and were put to work for the U.S. In the weeks after Germany's surrender, American troops combed the European countryside to search for hidden caches of weaponry to collect. And they were shocked at the things that they found. Annie Jacobsen wrote in her book Operation Paperclip, the secret intelligence program that brought Nazi scientists to America, that they had no idea that Hitler had created this whole arsenal of nerve gas, and they didn't know that Hitler was working on a bubonic plague weapon. So this is where Paperclip began, where the Pentagon realized that, well, we need these weapons for ourselves. But it wasn't just enough to study the weapons, because the Soviet Union, the one-time allies of the Nazis, were doing the same thing. The U.S. government hatched a plan to bring 88 Nazi scientists captured during the fall of Nazi Germany back to America and get them back on the job. The military tried to whitewash their past, and the scientists called themselves prisoners of peace, but many of them did have blood on their hands. Wernher von Braun was one of the brains behind the V-2 rocket program, but also knew what was going on in the concentration camps. And he actually handpicked people from terrible places, including concentration camps, to work to build his rockets. Operation Paperclip was top secret. Many of these weapons were classified, and even agents with the Justice Department's Office of Special Investigations, which the U.S. government tasked with hunting Nazi officers who fled after the war, didn't know for decades the extent to which government officials were collaborating with their one-time enemy. The United States benefited from the expertise of these scientists for their rocket program, and they also learned much from Germany's jet engine industry, with respect to the engines themselves and on German testing procedures. The German chemical industry also held value for the United States, as Germans had invested in developing synthetic oil and rubber technology. In terms of what to do with this technology, as long as there weren't scientists that were directly caught up in it and able to train Americans, like in Operation Paperclip, one idea was to develop a public-private partnership where U.S. firms would send their own personnel to Europe to investigate their German counterparts and try to learn as much as they could. The U.S. government supported this, hoping to facilitate technical and scientific process in the American business sector. But interestingly enough, Americans were disappointed by what they found in Germany. When they investigated areas where they thought there would be major advances, like machine tooling or assembly line procedure and similar areas that U.S. engineers had been working, there wasn't anything terribly advanced about what Germany was doing. There's many different reasons for this. Douglas O'Regan writes in his book Taking Nazi Technology that there are 3 reasons that, other than a few wonder weapons, Germany really wasn't that far ahead. First, the anti-Semitic nature of the German regime drove scientists and engineers away. Second, the regime made it difficult for German engineers to collaborate with foreign scientists and learn about foreign inventions because they were disinvited from conferences and shunned by collaborators. And while the immense German investment in military capabilities did drive innovation, it drew funding away from basic research and civilian applications. So it goes to show that taking foreign technology is harder than it seems. So in the age of intellectual property theft and talk about China stealing the intellectual property of other governments, it's not as simple just to copy, cut, and paste other people's work. And as we saw at the end of World War II, it's hard for scientific progress to advance unless there's an international base, with scientists and engineers benefiting from knowledge and expertise from colleagues. Scientific breakthrough doesn't come from a top-down, cloistered program for the most part. I mean, the Manhattan Project is an exception, but you had a massive nation with its full military base devoted to it. So while there are some scattered small bits of truth to the idea of Nazi superweapons and Nazi superscience, for the most part, it's a myth that there were a few brilliant minds who were making advances like Wernher von Braun, but his best contribution to human civilization, the Apollo mission, happened when it was in the course of collaboration with people from other nations working together for a larger project. There you have it. That is all for today's episode. Once again, I want to start things off by thanking the Spy Masters of History Unplugged. I'll explain what that is in a second. Our Spy Masters include Bill Ivey, Moondoggy from Ohio, Tom from Ohio, Ryan Gillen, Rob from Chicago, Nick Brooks, Michael from New York, Carl from Norway, Josh Reddick, Jennifer French Lee, Jay Carrington, McCraze, David Santi, Chris C., and Baron Fraser. If you'd like to support the show, there's some very easy ways to do so. First, go to the site halfpricehistory.com. I've worked out an arrangement with a lot of the authors who've appeared on this show, and you can go there and get their books for 50% off. All you have to do is go to halfpricehistory.com and enter the promo code UNPLUGGED at checkout. Second, please leave a review and subscribe to this podcast on your favorite podcast player of choice, whether Apple Podcast or Spotify or Stitcher or whatever. Third, join our Facebook group. You can go to Facebook and search for History Unplugged. There, you can talk with other fans of the show about recent episodes, what you liked, what you didn't like. Also,